All right, if you have your Bibles, take them and open to Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. This is right where we left off from the scripture reading just a few minutes ago. The Sermon on the Mount began with the Beatitudes, and then we move into this section. We're going to read verses 13 to 16. If you're using one of our worship Bibles, page 958. Oh, this is titled Salt and Light. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So there is the salt and light passage from which the song we sang a few minutes ago comes from. And I want to spend just a few minutes looking at a few of the details without spending a huge amount of time on it. The first thing I want you to notice is that it begins verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. And then in a couple verses later, you are the light of the world. So he's addressing someone when he says this. And if we go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 1, where this begins, the Sermon on the Mount, we're told that Jesus saw a crowd, and so he walked away, went up on the mountainside and sat down, and his disciples came up there and joined him, and he began to teach them. So when he's talking, when he says you are, he's talking to his disciples. And of course, today, that is part and parcel to who we are. We say that our desire at Kenosha Family Church is to be Christ-like disciples. And our mission is to make Christ-like disciples. And so we believe that Jesus is talking to his followers. That's what a disciple is. Someone who's a true follower. Somebody who seeks out and listens to his teachings and then puts them into practice. That's what it means to follow Jesus. And so to his disciples, to those of us who are his followers today, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. That's who's being addressed here. So keep that in mind. It's actually a pretty big statement. The fact that it refers to his disciples and not somebody else. The salt of the earth. I want to just spend a moment talking about the idea of salt and what it might mean in a context like this. And there are several things. First of all, especially in Jesus' day and of course other times, salt is phenomenally important to us. And it was even more important back then. Suppose, for example, in first century Palestine, if you, this by the way was before the era of refrigeration. You catch a bunch of fish in the Sea of Galilee and you want to take them to market in Jerusalem, how do you transport them? Well, the first thing you do is pack them in salt. Salt turns out to be a phenomenal preservative. And so that is one of the reasons why it was so valuable. In fact, it was so valuable that there was times when Roman soldiers, that's how they were paid. Their salary was salt. The expression, is a man worth his salt? That comes from the idea of, is he worth his pay? Because the Latin word for salt is tied into our word salary. And some of you may recognize like saline. Anybody heard of a saline solution? Kind of a salt solution. That's where we get the word salary. It comes from that same root. And so that's how valuable salt was as a preservative. By the way, news just this week, by coincidence, Maybe. There's a salt mine in Austria that has been in operation for thousands of years. And they keep opening new sections of it and returning to sections of it, and they figured that a small percent of it in our modern era has been explored. And they went into a previously hadn't been to for hundreds of years section and discovered what they claim to be the oldest wooden staircase in the world that is known. And there in that salt mine, there's a set of wood stairs that go up about, I think they said about 20 meters, that they say are 3,000 years old. And that wood staircase, they said, is perfectly preserved because of the salt. It's in a salt mine. That's the kind of mine that it is. And they said it's preserved well enough that they were able to like dismantle it and reassemble it. It wasn't just a rickety, you touch it and it falls apart kind of a thing. So it is a preservative. You rub meat down and the meat lasts longer, so on and so forth. It's also, of course, a flavor booster. I know people that if I go to a restaurant with them, you sit down, the first thing they do before they even taste their food is they pick up the salt shaker and add salt. I know other people who taste it first, oh, this needs salt, and then they add the salt. But I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but most of us prefer that our food be somewhat salted. Salt just makes it taste better. In fact, there are those who say that salt doesn't really add flavor, salt brings out the flavor, they claim. I think that, you salt it, it tastes salty, which is fine. Another characteristic of salt is that it is a thirst creator. I don't hang out in bars, but I'm familiar through pop culture with the concept. Why do you think they serve peanuts and pretzels at bars? These pretzels are making me thirsty. That concept. Salt does that. In fact, the old expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. One of the gentlemen in one of my previous churches used to say, yeah, Pastor, but you can give him some salt block and that'll make him drink. So there are ways. But salt does that. So if you think about those parallel to Christianity, the Christian culture, it is believed that Christianity is a preservative in our world. As one person put it, as bad as our world is, take out the influence of Christianity for the last 2,000 years. If the church was just gone, had never existed, think about how different society would be, how different culture would be. We have that positive influence there. We preserve our culture. A flavor booster, the idea that life should be better for Christians. It makes life better. You have joy and fulfillment that the world cannot have. And thirst creator. People ought to be looking at us, looking at you, and saying, I want what you have. And that they should be thirsty based on observing you and your actions. And so that's part of the reasons why Jesus used the metaphor, the salt of the earth. And then, of course, he used the term the light of the world. A few things about the light that he talks about and brings out. One of those is that, a good light is not covered. You don't take your lamp and light it and then put it under a 100% opaque shade. Now, we use lamp shades to kind of, tame the light a little bit. But the idea is the light shines through them and can be seen, and we have lamps in our prominent places. Places like this building, we put in ceiling lights. You don't just, light a light and then cover it with something. That wouldn't make any sense. Now, they referenced a city on a hill. In that time, their cities were built, their construction was those limestone stones and they were generally shades of white. And so you put a city like that on a hill, they become very reflective. And if you're walking toward one, you can see it from miles away as they reflected light, and they shone almost like a light themselves. A city on a hill had that effect. Never mind any lights that may have been burning in the city. But you know, the lights are not covered. And another thing is, I want to point out that we're talking about more like a spotlight than a chandelier. What is the difference? A chandelier is typically designed to be beautiful. They are a decorative item. You hang a chandelier in your dining room, people should walk in and, ooh, that's pretty. I love that chandelier, and so on and so forth. Whereas a spotlight, not much to look at. But they are designed to put light on something else that lights it up and illuminates it. And when we're the light of the world, we are really supposed to be more like a spotlight type. We're not supposed to be beautiful lights that people look at and say, ooh, you're awesome. We're supposed to be the kind of light that shines on God and highlights Him and illuminates Him to the world around us. Another thing we need to notice, this particular passage kind of gets about it in a roundabout way. I'll get to it in a minute. But our light source is we reflect. You see, God is the source of the light. And later in this passage he talks about the idea that people see your good deeds and it glorifies your Father. That's kind of how that works, because it's actually God's that's doing it. You know, your good deeds are God-based. God is the source. And so, you know, our moon gives off a good light at night, but we all know in our modern era of science that it does so because the sun is reflecting off the moon, not because the moon has a light source of its own. It's not, you know, on fire. It's not burning like a star is burning or like our sun is burning. And so we need to think about, when we're the light of the world, we're that way. We are reflecting God's light. We're not generating our own light. How many of you are familiar with the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment is a period of our history, the 16 and 1700s, in which, coming out of the quote-unquote Dark Ages, there was actually people talking about happiness. You know, in the Dark Ages, people didn't think about having the right to be happy or pursuing happiness. Survival was what it was all about. You just wanted to make it through. You wanted to live, and you get up every day as a drudgery, and you know, you do what you did yesterday so that you can survive. And that was kind of life in the Dark Ages. And in the Enlightenment, they began to say, you know, there's more to life than that. We should be thinking about what we can do to be happy, and things like the arts began to explode and get more and more popular. And there was a great thirst for knowledge. We want to know more. We want to learn more. Reason, our ability to reason, became very important, and it was given credit, and our senses were given credit. What we could see and hear and taste and feel, and all, you know, that became very important during the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment came on the heels of the science revolution. Science had kind of come to the forefront in the 1500s, 1400s, and it changed the way people saw life. And it created what they thought of as the Enlightenment. And so that time period is called the Age of Enlightenment, or simply the Enlightenment a lot of the times. But here's the thing, and here's why I bring this up. According to Jesus, you're the light of the world. You're responsible for the real enlightenment. If you do what this passage teaches us, if we are the light of the world, then we bring about true enlightenment. What is known as the Enlightenment is actually kind of a step lower. It's a weaker enlightenment. True enlightenment is seeing God and learning about God and learning to know God and come into relationship with God, because you are the light of the world, not Galileo, not the scientific method. And this is coming from a pro-science guy. I like science, and I enjoy science, and I generally trust science. But real enlightenment is about God, not science. As much as we learn from science, it has to be placed in perspective with God. Another couple things I want to point out in this section before we move on is that when it talks about being the salt and being the light, it's of the earth and of the world. How big is that? It doesn't say you are the light of your Sunday school class. You are the salt of your Sunday school class. It's easy to do that, to come into Sunday school and share and it says you're the light of the earth and the light of the world. You know what? Those things are out there, not in here. You are the light not in here. You are the light out there. You are the salt out there. You're not supposed to be preserving the institution of the church. You're supposed to be preserving the earth. Those are huge concepts, and those are out there concepts. We often talk about, ministry beyond the four walls of the church. Yeah, this passage is all about that. We need to be salt and light, not when we gather, but when we disperse and go out into the world. Well, let's move on from there. Matthew 5:17 to 19. Jesus continues talking. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not even the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be great in the kingdom of heaven. Scholars are pretty much agreed that this represents either a response to early criticism or a preemptive strike. That means that the things Jesus has taught, beginning in chapter 4, where it says he began to preach and going around saying, between then and the time he delivers this sermon, there are people who are already criticizing him with the idea that, he's come to change things, he's come to abolish the law and the prophets, he's kind of wanting to supersede those and give us something new, he's wanting to change our religion, and so Jesus is responding to that criticism right up front. Or Jesus knew that criticism was about to begin and was about to launch, and so he decided to address it head on before it even had a chance to start. And so all of a sudden, what seems like it's out of the blue to us makes more sense if it was Jesus responding to that criticism. He goes from "you are the salt and the light" to "do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." So he tells us that he's come not to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. I want to just talk briefly about this concept because when it's the prophets, we get the idea that to fulfill them was like to prove them to be true. So like if Isaiah prophesies that Jesus will come from Bethlehem, Jesus fulfilled that prophecy by coming from Bethlehem. And so that's part of what it means to fulfill. But it means more than that. What is really going on here is when Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets, he came to give the law and the prophets its full meaning. Everything that the Old Testament talked about and foreshadowed and pointed toward, Jesus gives it its full meaning. The Old Testament, God was teaching us and guiding us and directing us. And during that time, we were learning more and more about him. But it was fulfilled. We learn its true meaning through Jesus Christ. He came and showed us what God really meant. So God taught that, there has to be a sacrifice for sin and all those things. Jesus was the sacrifice. He brought fulfillment to that. We don't need to make more sacrifices now. That's been done. And so he came to fulfill that. And he says he did so in every detail. So including God's moral code, those commands that he gave us and stuff, that those should be kept in every detail. He uses that concept of the smallest letter. And in Hebrew, with the law and the prophets were written in, the smallest letter looks almost like an apostrophe. It's a pretty tiny letter, a letter yod, and it's pretty small. And then he talks about, every mark of the pen, least stroke of the pen. They would add little dots and dashes to kind of show how they were pronounced and stuff. And so in English, it would be almost like us saying, dot every I and cross every T. Those little details. And so the problem is that created a threat that had to be addressed. If you're telling people to continue to follow the law and do so in every detail to the smallest stroke of the pen, the threat is that you could fall into a letter of the law legalism. The idea of, you just got to follow this so closely and as long as you meet the detail, you'll be okay. Guess who became a master at following the law to the letter? By Jesus' time. The Pharisees. There's that group of people that show up in the Bible a lot. One of the things that they became specialists at were following the law in every detail. So, there's talk about the idea of tithing. You're supposed to give 10%. And Jesus points out at one time, he gives the Pharisees credit because when they would go out into their herb garden and harvest a little bit of dill for the cooking today, they would take that dill into their table and they would cut out a 10th part of it and then take that and give it to the temple, whatever, because they were going to follow this to the letter. They weren't going to cut any choices anywhere. So the Pharisees became experts at following the law to the letter, which brings us to verse 20, where surprisingly Jesus says to them, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." So telling people that, you've got to follow every detail of the law, but you've got to do it better than the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were experts at it. I mean, that was their life. In fact, the Pharisees kind of had a grudge against the rest of the country who weren't Pharisees for not following the law as closely as they did. They believed that if everyone would only follow the law like they did, that God would deliver Israel from the Roman Empire and the Messiah would come and all of that stuff would happen. That it was because of you non-Pharisees not following the law to the letter like they did that was causing all the problems. So God tells them that your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, I think the answer is that it's a matter of the heart. It's a matter of what's inside. I want to tell you a story from years ago. I was fresh out of seminary at my first church, and at my first church as a pastor, we had a handful of men who liked to golf. And so I kind of got drafted into golfing. And this is not me, but it illustrates the game. But I had a problem in what in the golf world is called the slice. So a golfer, when you're hitting off the tee with that driver, the idea, of course, is you're aiming to put the ball out there or out there, and if you slice the ball, it causes a spin of the ball, and the ball takes off where you're aiming, and then it goes, and it curves way to the right, if you're a right-handed golfer. So that's a slice, and I had a pretty bad one. I hit the ball, and it would be going what looked like pretty good, and then all of a sudden it would start bending, and it ended up 20 yards or so right on where I was aiming. Well, enter my friend Daryl, one of my church members. That's really Daryl, except that's him now instead of then. Daryl was really good at this game. And after watching me slice a few of these, we finally get to a hole. And Daryl says, "Pastor, let me help you. This is what you need to do." And he began to instruct me about how I needed to move my hand farther around on my grip, and I needed to follow through better. And there are several tips that he gave me to eliminate the slice from my game. And so after several minutes of this instruction on the green, the other guy that was golfing with us, my other church member, Roger says, "Pastor, that stuff that Daryl said is good for some people. People like you and me," and he was condescending there because he was way better golfing than me. He says, "We're not going to master that stuff. Here's what you need to do, Pastor. You know that when you hit that ball, you're going to slice it, and it's going to go about 20 yards that way. So step up to that tee, Pastor, and aim about 20 yards over there. And then it will land over there where you want it to." And so completely different approaches. Both of them were going to get me to the green. That was the idea. But the truth is, there's a right way to the green and a wrong way to the green. And Roger was telling me to take the shortcut. Don't worry about it. Just adjust so that when you'll get on the green, it won't be pretty, but you'll get there. Instead of doing it the right way. Instead of fixing it and hitting straight and hitting where you aim. So the point is, of course, that there's also a right way to keep the law and a wrong way to keep the law. Keeping the law, for example, when you don't want to, but you do so because you're afraid of the consequences if you get caught. Like it's against the rules to steal. If you knew you could get away with it, would you steal? Or have you learned that, well, if I steal, I'm going to get caught, I'm going to get in trouble? Do you keep the law because of what might happen if you don't? Or do you keep the law because you believe in the law and want to keep the law and think, that's kind of the right way and the wrong way. And what we find is that the Pharisees were keeping the law to every detail, but it wasn't in their heart to do so. They didn't have that respect for the law, that love of the law. They were meticulous in keeping the law for the wrong reasons. It wasn't in their heart. You have to go beyond just keeping the letter of the law to having it be in your heart. You've got to want to keep the law the right way. Because otherwise, that's how you surpass the Pharisees. You're both going to, on the green, you're both going to keep the details of the law. But one of you is doing so with the right heart, and the other is doing so with the wrong heart. Kind of like you just, you're going to slice, so you aim that way, so that the ball will land over there. Or do you fix your slice? That's kind of what's being talked about here. Jesus moves on from this passage and gives us half a dozen or so, 7 examples of how this works itself out in life. And I want to look at just one of those, the first one, the next couple of verses, to see kind of how this works itself out in real life. Verses 21 and 22 of chapter 5. The next thing Jesus said, your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. Verse 21, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders is subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the courts. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, the first thing I want to do is point out that Jesus was not being legalistic here. Do not fall for the trap of treating those verses legalistically. The word Raka is an Aramaic word that's hard to translate. It was a term of contempt. So it's not a word that we use, but if you want to speak contemptuously to someone, and based on the value of Hebrew poetry that Jesus had been immersed in growing up and stuff, the idea of saying the same thing more than once using different words to say it, good Hebrew poetry, it is cold, boy is it freezing. That's Hebrew poetry. They're conveying the same thought 2 different ways. Don't say Raka, don't say you fool. Here's something that you need to know. I grew up in a culture with Sunday school teachers, pastors, adults in the church, who taught me that it was a sin to call people a fool. Guess what? I could call my sister an idiot, or say that she was stupid, or hey you dummy, but never fool. Because Jesus taught us in Matthew 5, you couldn't call your brother or sister a fool. And that's how they interpreted that passage. But this passage, those are just examples that Jesus was using. Jesus was really saying, not only can you not murder, but you also can't have that kind of disdain and contempt in your heart that you would speak to your brothers and sisters that way. You're in just as much danger of judgment for treating them that way and having that in your heart as if you murder them. That's what he was saying. You have to, it's not just, well, I'm going to obey the law and not kill my sister today. You've got to love your sister. You can't have that kind of contempt for her. If you use that language, it's coming out of how you feel about her, how you feel about that person. If you're doing that, and by the way, one of the close meanings of Raka, that Aramaic word that we don't translate, is worthless. How many of you have read a news story and said to somebody else or out loud or to yourself, that worthless scumbag? Because that's how you felt about that person who committed that particular crime or did that particular thing. Worthless scumbag. That's what Jesus is talking about in this passage. That's tough, isn't it? Because we're supposed to feel that way again about our enemies, about the criminals in our culture. That guy who beat his wife and doesn't pay child support. Worthless scumbag. Well, Jesus died for that person, hoping that they would repent and be reconciled. Maybe they won't be, but the hope that we should have is that they are, rather than hoping that they get what's coming to them. That's what Jesus is talking about here. Our righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. We're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. Remember from a week or two ago, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. We're not just talking about dying and going to heaven someday, but being a part of his kingdom. So we say again, our challenge, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So think about that this week. Work on that this week. You might even want to read the rest of these next examples that God gives us here in the Sermon on the Mount. Let's pray.